Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of All the Angles, the Business of Padel podcast, powered by the Hexagon Cup. Joining me as the guest anchor is Astrid Thams, who has spent her career working originally with Real Madrid, then through to Adidas, then Fanatics, and she's now in her current role as Managing Director of the Hexagon Cup. And joining us for this topic is Sebastian Gordon, who is the founder of Rocket Padel, which launched in 2018. And before that, he's been a founder in the events and hospitality space for a number of years. And we also have Andreas Karlsson, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at MATCHi, which is one of the leading platforms bringing clubs and players together for racket sports across the world. So the topic of today's episode is Sweden. We need to talk about Sweden. So Sweden over the last few years has become a bit of a poster child in the industry as an indicator of what can go wrong when padel gets overexcited in a market, goes too fast, and then struggles to maintain the pace that it set for itself. So the context is in 2023, Bloomberg wrote an article where the headline said, "Sweden holds a grim warning for a potential crash in the global padel market." And I think from there, this reputation was established for the country. And what I really wanted to do with this group is to try and get under the skin of what actually happened in Sweden and what is actually still happening in Sweden, so that everyone can understand what are myths about the market and what are the lessons that really should be learned from the last 5-10 years in that country. So let's start with the rise of padel. Let's start way back leading up to COVID, up to about 2021. So let's start with you, Sebastian. Obviously, you launched Rocket Padel initially out of Scandinavia, out of Sweden in 2018. You were involved in padel before that. Can you kind of set the scene of why Sweden picked up this relatively niche sport that was popular in the Hispanic countries? I wouldn't have assumed a Scandinavian country would be the obvious next big market for the sport of padel.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having all of us. I think with Sweden, honestly, it could have been any country, but I think there are a number of factors that made Sweden boom very fast. We had the first couple of 3, 4, 5, 6 courts. Andreas probably knows this better than I. It was not until PDL launched in Stockholm, I think it was around 2014, that it actually started to boom. I think it started to gain a lot of attention. And one of the main factors, honestly, I mean, Sweden is a very, not only entrepreneurial country, but Swedes like to pick up trends, let's put it that way. And we sort of like to be trendsetters. So when there's something new, we're very keen on trying it and we're not scared of the barriers around it. And I think around that period where PDL started the first club in a place called Frihamnen in Stockholm, it's very near the Swedish broadcasting channel TV4. And there was a number of people playing there. It was only 5 courts, I remember, because I was actually playing in their league. There was a number of people playing that were TV stars. And also the investors in the first club were also celebrities in Sweden. And I think that sort of was the starting point of the attention. People were getting interested in padel. So the start went pretty fast. And this club was actually full, more or less all the time after just a couple of months. I remember I was trying to get a court out of there, and you needed to either join the league, and to join the league you needed to have a certain level, or you need to play daytime. So it was a very high occupancy from day one, and I think that was sort of one of the main things that got Swedes interested in the game. At the same point as this, you have to remember that the padel player usually, I'm not going to typecast myself here, but it's typically middle-aged men, at least in the start, maybe with a certain position in businesses. They have their own businesses and they are entrepreneurial and investors. So I think a lot of people saw that this club is practically full all the time. We could just open up a club, across the street, or let's take this to Gothenburg. And I was one of the people that were like, okay, I can start this in my hometown and see how it goes. So I think that was mainly the starting point of Swedes really getting this sport. And obviously also there's a connection to Spain. A lot of Swedes love to travel to Palma de Mallorca, Marbella, where paddle had been obviously, very established for a number of years. So that probably fueled the interest quite a bit as well.
And what about the kind of the building and regulatory setting? Because you can have a club that does well, you can have lots of people interested, but the proliferation of clubs and courts kind of followed pretty quickly after that. And what is it about the Swedish market that really allowed or enabled such a rapid growth of courts and the building of those courts? Because that was obviously another piece of the puzzle.
I just wanted to add to that. I mean, so if you fast forward the tape, this PDL club was actually in an old industrial building. And you have to remember that Sweden is an old industrial country. So there are lots of facilities with proper ceiling heights that are, semi-vacant or fully vacant. And I think also that sort of made the opportunity a little bit more available.
Yeah, and compared to many other countries where we have traveled, I mean, it seems to be much easier in Sweden to get the permits as well to construct and build paddle facilities. And to add to Sebastian, I think one main reason to why it started in Sweden is the fact that we spend a lot of time in Spain. And a lot of the first clubs we saw here in Sweden were mainly not so much about the business case. It was a lot of passionate paddle players that wanted to build courts here in their home country. And then the boom came when people really started to believe in this as a strong business case as well. Then we saw entrepreneurs, investors, etc. coming into the space. And in the beginning, we had many clubs and courts that were just for the pure sake of being able to play and the passion of the sport.
Do you think that as well Sweden's existing racket sports pedigree did play a role for being paddle, the sports that was picked, for example, for all the TV stars you mentioned to start playing?
We have a strong racket heritage in Sweden, obviously. Me, myself, I come from small town outside Stockholm called Södertälje, which is actually the birthplace of Björn Borg. So, I mean, we are practically forced to play tennis when we grow up. So I think a lot of people that started paddle early, as Andreas said, is what passion about the sport. Obviously, then the business case grew. People started to look at the math, and that's where I think a lot of people sort of failed, many of them. However, I think those are the main pillars of Sweden to grabbing it up easy. The celebrities picking it up early, we being an industrial country with a lot of facilities available for indoor paddle. Obviously the racket heritage, and I think lastly it's also regarding the permits. I can tell you by own experience that it's not as easy in the UK to get a permit as it is in Sweden. And I think what happened in Sweden is that you have something called, in Swedish it's called the tillfälligt bygglov, which is a temporary permit, and you can get it for 5 years and then you usually get it renewed every 5 years. Whereas, for example, if you compare this to the UK and probably many other countries, you have the problem with the zoning on top of this. And the zoning in the UK is something very important because the owners of these facilities, usually they're owned by big pension funds. I'm at the moment, I'm dealing with the German pension fund, and they might have a certain book value on the facility based on industrial zoning. And if you change the zoning to leisure, the value of the facility, might decrease. And then they need to obviously write down the value of their own facility. So even if I pay them a premium rent, they're not very keen on writing down the value of their facility because that could probably, interfere with their covenants or their loans or interests and a number of factors. And I think this is something that Swedes, we never had to take that challenge on. We practically got the permits up, and I think it was a strong goodwill from the Swedish government or for the local councils, kommuner, to actually do this because they wanted people to activate themselves, to exercise, and there's very limited space to play tennis. If you want to book a tennis court in Stockholm, you have to stand in line like 3 years to get a court. So it's very difficult to play tennis. So obviously when people saw that paddle was rising, I think there was obviously a goodwill from everybody to allow this. And then obviously it went a little bit too fast.
I was just curious about now when you're expanding to UK, do you consider the permits as a moat and sort of a competitive advantage as you scale and grow now? Because it's more complicated and gives you more maybe security once you have passed the process.
Sort of, but like I reasoned when we opened in Sweden, I think it's positive that more people open up. And we are mainly focusing on London with Rocket Paddle, and in Denmark, we're a little bit more divided into several cities. But here in London, the space is very difficult to find anyways. So I think for the growth of the sport, I'd be happy to have another club opening as well. I don't see growth as much as competition as we maybe did in Sweden, because there's not enough land here. There's no plot outside of me where I can build, 20 courts. Whereas in Jönköping, you can build, they actually did build like, I don't know, 7, 10 clubs in a small town with 100,000 inhabitants. So not the same sort of feeling like when you get the permit that you have a competitive advantage. However, I think what it's going to do is that it's going to help the market grow at a more, let's say, reasonable pace. And maybe it's better for the sport, because what really happens is that you get time to build the foundation of a club. And that wasn't necessary in Sweden. You can more or less open up the doors and you were full day one. And that obviously makes the owners and the operators lazy. Like they become fat cats, all of them, and then just keep opening instead of building the club and building the content and building the product. So I think that's a good thing, that we get a little bit more time to establish all of those processes and contents.
And then COVID comes around 2021. I think the obvious thing that happened in a lot of countries, but obviously Sweden as well, was this effectively almost like a loophole to indoor social distancing that Padel seemed to kind of manage to squeeze through, where a lot of sports that were indoors just failed the social distancing test and couldn't be done, whereas Padel, for some reason, managed to slip through the net and was therefore permittable. And so for a lot of people who had a lot of time, who wanted to do exercise, especially in Sweden, where the weather may not have been very conducive to doing things outdoor, this was probably one of the only indoor sport opportunities that people had. So was that the main reason that COVID changed the game in Sweden, or were there other factors? What did you see, Andreas, as the data started coming in on the uptake of usage of courts once COVID kicked in?
Yeah, I would say that the success of Padel has already started a year before, or maybe 2 years before COVID even. We already had a lot of clubs, and it was already a very popular sport in Sweden. Then, of course, COVID came, and people started to work from home. Restaurants, nightclubs, other bigger events closed down. You could pay off-peak to another extent compared to previously, and there was not that much else to do. I remember one time during COVID, a friend asked me if we should play Padel, and he managed to find a time at 2 a.m. in the morning on a Wednesday. And I was like, that's not a very good time, but let's do it. I'm working from home. I can sleep a little bit longer tomorrow. So I went to the club, and when I walked in the city, I couldn't see a single person in the city. It was completely dead. And then I came into the club, opened the door, and it was packed with people inside the club. And it was people playing on the courts. It was people waiting to jump on the courts. And I was like, oh my God, this is insane. It feels like the whole world is about to shut down, but Padel is here to save all of us. And if you had that type of first experience when you started to play Padel, that effect on people is significant, and the culture it creates gets extreme. So many people, I think, started to play, and they got hooked by Padel, maybe not primarily due to the passion to play or to the sport, but from these other aspects that got very boosted during COVID. But again, it was going very, very strong even before COVID. We had a lot of customers that was waiting to open in our pipeline, and it had very strong traction. And then COVID came and just was the final thing that made it really skyrocket.
I think you could even, Alex, see the effect in Spain, because to what you said, I think it slipped, you said, through being indoor, and as well like that you could socialize, because you could go out running, but Padel allowed you the opportunity to be able to, you couldn't play football because it was a contact sport, but then you could play Padel and you could socialize. So I think that factor that Padel brings as well with it, it's between four and it has the socializing effect. You can even see that as well in Spain, there was a big uplift where the numbers were already for the last 30, 40 years. you had it, but still you could see the DAP flip. So through having the social side of the sport is also something that I'm sure as well for Sweden it had an impact as well.
And within a year of COVID starting in October, Triton launches LeDap, which is like this ambitious fund with 90 centres and 600 courts across North and Central Europe. What did that signify to the market? Because I feel like that was a kind of almost like the high point. That was when everyone was optimistic, when investors were trying to pile in as quickly as possible, consolidate and grow. And you had this massive $5 billion fund putting money into the sport across this huge chunk of Europe. Was that a moment where everyone was celebrating, or was this a moment where everyone was like, wait, hold on a second, this is a big statement. Are we ready for this? Is the sport ready for this?
Yeah, I think most of us did celebrate. We were just happy to have more actors and more eyes on us. It was still just in Sweden, and I think all of us had some kind of ambition to make paddle a big global sport. And Triton, together with LeDap, they also had this vision to make it to the Olympics. And I think it was a positive signal, and all of us were celebrating it initially, for sure. And it also made for many club owners a new possibility, because previously they had maybe earned some money from cash flow and dividends, but now they had a clear acquisition strategy or a clear way to sell their business, which was a little bit new to them. I don't know if you have, Sebastian, any situations or if you got an offer from the market.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories in that sort of window of acquisitions. But in general, you can say this. I think that it was not only Triton's LeDap. I think it was also actually a combination of the other one, which was fueled by Fidelio Capital together with PDL and the merger with Padel United. And I think that sort of fueled a couple of situations where club owners got into bidding wars between these two. And I think a couple of them, especially in Stockholm, that they got a lot more money than they would have gotten from just one, because they had a AAA location, and it was very important for both LeDap and Fidelio to grab these clubs. And then obviously people made these business decisions upon the numbers that they heard that you can get for a club. So people actually even sold contracts that weren't even built, that only had the building permit, and those were even sold as well. So it was good at the beginning, but I think pretty fast a lot of people understood that this is not going to work out, because the numbers that these funds were paying, it was just not reasonable, even with a high occupancy, that they will get their returns back within, let's say 7 to 10 years, which is a very long period, even on a regular business acquisition. So I think that they knew this, but they betted on that the market would probably sustain. And they also understood that once you have a good location in Stockholm, no one else is going to be able to open up next to you. So they sort of wanted these positions in the market, and I think that was a really bad thing for the sport in general. I mean, they had a good intention with the effort to get into the Olympics, obviously, but also what happens is that when you buy a club, is that usually they wanted the operator or the owner to stay on, but the owner becomes obviously semi-rich, or at least, makes a decent exit, but he's supposed to stay on. The problem is that he's maybe more keen on, buying a boat and travel the world or whatever. No, I mean, honestly, I've seen it happen several times. And I think also that made, operations sloppier. So it was a very difficult task. I think Triton did their best and Fidelio, but it just wasn't possible. Even if they wouldn't have been struck by COVID, it would have been a very difficult task to perform in such a short period of time. So very interesting to be part of this. I was part of several negotiations. We were co-founders of a club in Norway that was sold to PDL. So there were a number of deals happening, but I think many people deep in the industry really knew that this was not healthy at all. I think people knew it, but they sort of enjoyed the ride.
So what was the tipping point? When did things go wrong? And why did they go wrong? You mentioned that there was this feeling that there was a bubble growing in this sector, but when did it all start going wrong?
But my feeling is that it was practically like 6 to 12 months after the restrictions were released. That was my feeling, because during the period under COVID, a lot of people took decisions on those numbers, like high occupancy. Obviously, you have to remember that we were also in a very low interest situation in Sweden. So you could borrow money like for free, which meant that real estate investors were very aggressive as well. So they were handing out contracts with low down payments, etc. And obviously, all of this combined fueled a lot of buildings, a lot of paddle establishments. And I think once they actually, they took the decisions during COVID, but it took a year to build the clubs. So then when the restrictions released and people wanted to start, going to the cinema or whatever, that was actually the same time as all these new clubs opened. And they opened up more or less empty. People have told me that the bookings were quite steady, but there were so many other courts opening up. So in general, you can come to a club and it was like maybe 15% occupancy. But Sweden was playing almost as much paddle. But the problem was that you came to a club and it wasn't full because there were so many clubs. So maybe, I don't know, Andreas, if you can shine some light on that. But
No, but you're totally right. The bookings stayed on a very stable level for like 2 years, but the number of courts, they quadrupled. And that, of course, has a huge effect on the occupancy. And that is also something that increases the effect I just described, walking into a place that is crowded, music, a lot of people, you see celebrities. And then 1 year later, you walk into a place and it feels half death, and you have read articles about the paddle death. And now you walk into a place and you can almost feel it, like no one is playing this anymore. It's not as trendy as it was. So I think that also had a big impact on the decrease in bookings that then started. That people's impression of it was that it was actually quite empty in the facilities. This was not cool anymore.
How big was it in the media?
It was definitely a lot of media coverage around paddle, both during the success and also during the decline. We had a few podcasts and newspapers here in Sweden, but also the big newspapers were covering paddle quite frequently, especially since Triton and Coeli started to invest in it. It became like a big industry, and it was covered by many business podcasts.
So once you had this situation developing where the number of courts and clubs was, as you said, quadrupling, the number of players was either stable or later actually decreasing as people were starting to feel like they were hanging on to a dying trend. Mm-hmm. I guess there was a contraction, right? So what did that contraction look like? Did people stop building courts? Did those who were going to build courts stop building courts? Did people start merging clubs? What did the contraction and the consolidation look like? The ultimate question is, has that contraction now stopped?
My feeling is that people stayed positive for a very long time. And paddle was still growing, in Denmark, Norway, Finland, and it's growing on a global level as well. So there are reasons to be long-term positive towards paddle. It is a growing sport, even if Sweden went a little bit too extreme. There were also a lot of bankruptcies, but we didn't see a big decrease in number of courts because many of them was taken over by the real estate owner maybe, or another group of entrepreneurs wanted to continue to try with a new club. So even though you could read a lot about shutdowns, the courts actually remained in the industry by new owners.
And to Alex, to your point, like, is there appetite nowadays, like today, in 2024? Like, what is the reaction if someone tells you that you want to set up a business in paddle?
It might be hard to get a loan and financing in Sweden. It's still it's not a very positive hype around it. But again, long term, it is here to stay, and it's growing in many other countries. So I believe that will also help Sweden to get back a little bit, and then maybe we will see an increase in bookings, a number of new players 3 years from now when paddle has gotten traction in US, might be part of the Olympics, and so on. The people that play paddle now, they do it because they really enjoy playing paddle. They are very passionate. We don't see so many influencers or celebrities maybe playing paddle in Sweden anymore as they used to do. Previously, it was a cool thing to post on your Instagram story, but that's not the case in Sweden. But the people we see now, they are the ones that are playing for 2 times a week. They're part of a league. They do some activities, and they do it because that's their sport. That's what they're doing.
For me, it's almost like a high school reunion. When I go playing in Stockholm now, it's like oh, it's the old gang from 2018, from 2019. It's like the people that have stayed on because of passion of the sport, right? Not because it was a trend or maybe, during COVID it was the only thing allowed to do, to exercise and to socialize. But I think, and this is an important factor, I think that it's very important to compare apples to apples here, because Sweden at one point, obviously we were on steroids. We shouldn't compare Sweden's paddle situation today to the one we had in 2021. Maybe we should compare it to 2019. Like, how are the numbers going? When I go to clubs, because I still live in Stockholm, I see the clubs are pretty well booked. There are leagues. I know that the tour has never been stronger. I know that the academies and the youth coming up, they've never been better. It takes time to build a sport. And I think if you look at one of the questions previously, how does it look today and who's running the clubs? My feelings is that, speaking of the contraction, is that the ones that are left now are pretty much the ones that were early. And they aren't there now because they were early. They are there now because when they took the decision to go into paddle, it wasn't based on COVID numbers. So they might have chosen an arena or a club or a facility that has lower rent, that has a AAA location, a strong academy because they've been around for a long time. So those are the clubs that I see now. I mean, a good friend, Andreas Anvall, Uppsala Padel Center, has to be mentioned. He's like Dom Padel in Sweden. He's been working with youngsters, and he still is, right? It's the newly built clubs that are built on a square meter price, 200 euros per square meter in rent, which is obviously maybe 100 to 200% higher than the clubs that opened in 2019. So the unit economics changed along this journey. So now what happened in the contraction was that all the clubs that were paying very expensive leases, they just can't survive. So the ones that are back are the ones that were there early because they're solid contracts, maybe lower rents, etc., etc.
Both of your conclusions seems to be that there was a good trend up to 2021 that was healthy, based on good economics and people who really cared and were prudent and sensible. Then there was a hiccup blip up with COVID and hype and restriction benefiters. And then that number decreased when the restrictions lifted and there were lots of choices again. You could go into the cinema, play football, go to the restaurant. Suddenly it's, paddle isn't the only rodeo in town. And so you lost that hump, you lost that blip. But actually, if you take away that blip, the trajectory remains healthy, it remains reasonable. The people who are in it are either prudent investors or actual genuine paddle aficionados. And that's as it should be. And that Sweden shouldn't be judged for what happened in that COVID-induced window. Because what I'm trying to get a sense of is, do you consider, looking at Sweden now, that it is still a success story? It is still a place with sound economics, with sound growth rates, with sound player bases, with all the fundamentals are actually in place if you just ignore what happened in that last 3 or 4 years where it all went a little bit overexcited?
Yeah, I would say so. And I also think Sweden has played a big role in influencing paddle venues in other countries as well. How to operate, what types of leagues should you use, what types of activities, how should you be thinking around the acoustics, the lighting. There were many companies started around paddle, tech companies, entrepreneurs that tried a lot of good ideas that are now being used in other countries as US, UK, Denmark. So in that sense, I think a lot of the things I see on a global level now actually started in Sweden by these entrepreneurs. Then the external factors that we had here in Sweden, yeah, they might explain the crazy jump and the decrease. But I'm also wondering if there are some internal attributes to paddle that is making it a little bit, because it's the first times you play, it's very addictive. You improve your skill level very fast, which makes a lot of players sort of fall in love with it. But then after you have played maybe 100 times, then it is a sport as any other sport where you really need to practice. I have a case on a small island where I can see they have been sort of isolated from all the external factors. I can see a little bit of the same trend in that club where paddle came to the island. It was, started a bit slow. You needed to educate the rules and so on, as always. Then it became very popular, and it became also this social thing where you challenged your friends. You wanted to figure out within your friend group who is the best within my friend groups. You reached out on Facebook and on WhatsApp to schedule games, and that took place for around 2 years. People were crazy about it, but now, when I came back this summer, I can feel that the interest now is not as big as it was last summer when I visited. I don't know how you resonate about that, Sebastian. If you have thought that you start a club, you get a lot of hype, and then after some time, that fades away a little bit, even without the external factors such as COVID and so on.
Yeah, there's obviously the internal factors are important to mention. And one being, if you take that group down so little, you make it so small that you just go down to 4 people, right? So I actually personally had a group of 4. We were playing every Monday. And then one of the guys dropped out because, I don't know, he just wanted to do something else. I don't even remember it. And then suddenly we don't have a game. So one guy drops out, but 4 people stops playing. So it becomes exponential if you break it down all the way to that small island. If they have 5 or 10 or 20 of those groups, but just one in each like small group decides to go fishing, or that this is not funny anymore, it's not 25% dropout from that group, it's 100%. So I think obviously that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And I think added to that, I think you also have to remember that at the same period when people started to maybe stop playing a little bit, that's when most of the clubs opened up. I mean, people were taking big bets on outdoor paddle as well. I've seen so many outdoor paddle clubs been vacant, like 100% empty, like the last 2-3 summers. So it's just a perfect storm. You also mentioned we've contributed to the growth of paddle globally and to the whole influencing paddle and growth around a number of other businesses. But I think obviously we need to blame ourselves for not, doing the math. Many of us, including the big funds, but local investors and entrepreneurs as well, or at least they did the wrong math.
Just to touch on that point about the exporting of Swedish expertise abroad. Obviously, Sebastian, you're doing your work in the UK. You've opened up one of the biggest clubs in the UK in London, in Ilford. You've got the Battersea Park, which is about to open. Then you've got, on the other side, you've got EEP Capital, who are headed up by a bunch of Swedish guys who are almost in the pole position when it comes to driving US development of clubs, and also the league out there with the PPL. So what do you think it is about the Swedish paddle entrepreneurs that kind of puts them in such a good position and that makes them take these opportunities? Why are we seeing them sprinkled so liberally through these kind of new frontiers for the sport?
I think, obviously EE Capital, good friends of mine, they're sort of investing in clubs, so they're not operating clubs themselves, as you know. But for us, I mean, we started looking at London and the UK very early, but it took us so long to get here. We were here actually pre-COVID, and we actually just missed out when COVID happened, and we were glad for that. I don't know. I mean, Swedes are very entrepreneurial, obviously, like we mentioned, and we are good at exporting our knowledge. I think the ones that we are talking about now is maybe a little bit of a coincidence as well. But I think sports has been very, very interesting the last 5 years. In Sweden, it was kind of cool to own a racket club. It was maybe like owning a nightclub in the 80s. I don't know. But there's a big trend now owning teams. People want to own, just like Hexagon Cup, they have teams. But if you look at NHL, if you look at the Premier League, I mean, you have obviously, Hollywood stars investing in sports. So I think that also helps the sport in general. And I think here, Swedes maybe have just by coincidence, since we saw what could have been done and what shouldn't be done, maybe there is a factor there that we try to use that knowledge, hopefully, to create something better. And like Andreas said, the growth of paddle globally is both steady and I would say strong and maybe even picking up pace. So I think there's a very interesting space to be in. Maybe I wouldn't invest in Sweden at the moment because I think that there's still some room for some more contraction. But I think today, from 3 years, I think paddle is going to be very strong in Sweden.
Yeah, I agree to your point that paddle has been growing so fast that there's a lot of interest in investing. And I think there are lots of people, and we talked about it sometime, that want to invest but don't really know how. And maybe that was as well what happened in Sweden when you put too much money and everything is to the court development. And I think from like Hexagon, we thought, hey, you have so many new players, so you have such a big amateur base, but you still miss having local heroes, local players, and you need that for children to look up to them and for kids to want to play. You were talking both about the opportunity of being on the Olympics and so on, and but then you said that the players were middle-aged men, so you need to invest into having grassroots, be it clubs with academies, and definitely, and like us doing these tournaments with celebrities that then bring big media and broadcast with it, because that's what's going to give more visibility to the sport. I think it's a little bit like it happened in Spain. At the beginning, you had Argentinian and Spanish players being the best. Now it has swapped a little bit more to Spain because kids have continued to play and haven't stopped, and that have given the success to the local players. And I don't know if you both would have an opinion, for example, on how long do you think it can be before we see Swedish at the top of the world rankings with the current investment scenario and trends that you see in Sweden?
That's a good question. I don't know where Daniel Windahl is placed now. He's at least top 50, right?
Yeah.
But he will probably not reach top 10, and that will still take probably a long time, I believe, before Sweden can have people on the top 10th global ranking. But there are definitely coming players now, 16 years old, that are very, very good. But if you compare to Spain and Argentina, it's just totally different volumes in number of players. So the likelihood that Sweden would be able to maybe have one during the next 5 or 7 years, I think is quite low still. I don't know. It remains to see. Our best bet now might be Daniel.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would bet 10 plus years. The problem is that as soon as we have super talent, usually we export them or they move to Madrid or Barcelona and they get a shot or they maybe don't get a shot. But the problem is that when that happens all the time, when you export all the talents, you don't get the new kids growing up to play them and to be even better because you need sparring partners. But I actually identify this as one big threat against the sport. I mean, the main reason that the Olympics, I don't think, is going to approve paddle is that it can't be a sport between two countries. You need to have competition from other countries. I think that the sport would benefit a lot if we would get a superstar from, he or she doesn't need to be Swedish, could be British or maybe even better American, I don't know, or Dutch. We need that. But if you look at the global ranking, especially on the men's side, you have two countries represented. It's not good.
But I think just to build on Astrid's question, I guess the wider question is, where is Sweden now? Where is Sweden going forward? And we've talked about some of this. So we've got the top players like Windahl. You've also got Navarro Bjork on the female side, who's competing this week in Malaga. You've got amateur numbers at the base that are still holding up at around 600,000 according to the 2024 report. You've got top events coming to the country, the P2 in October, and about, I think, 6 FIP Tour events last year. And perhaps the most encouraging is that Sweden came second place at the FIP Junior Worlds, so breaking the duopoly of Argentina and Spain. So what I'd love to get a sense of is, sitting here today in 2024, how optimistic are you about Sweden as a paddle country and as a paddle market?
I'm still very optimistic long term. Paddle, again, is here to stay. And when it grows in other countries, that will benefit Sweden as well. It will maybe bring some players back to the sport. We still have a lot of passionate people around paddle that is doing a lot of good, setting up academies, building out the infrastructure to give the opportunity to kids and the players. So I believe it will continue to grow in Sweden for sure. It will take time. You need to be patient about it. It will not happen tomorrow or the next year, but 7 or 5 years from now, I still believe paddle will be a very big sport in Sweden.
It's extremely difficult to build a sport, obviously, and talent in such a short period of time. It doesn't help to grow, 4,000 courts in 2 years. That's not going to speed up, I think. But if you look at Sweden compared to the other Scandinavian countries, we're a couple of steps ahead of them, and we probably will be a couple of steps ahead of them, and mainly on the youth side, because we have had time to build these academies, to build these relationships across borders down to Spain. bringing coaches. I mean, coach levels. We haven't spoken about that, but that's obviously a very important thing to get the development going. And the problem here has also been that those talents are mainly based in Spain, and now with the global expansion, obviously they're also attracted by money from other areas such as GCC, the UK. I see a lot of Spanish coaches and Argentinian coaches traveling here all the time. They used to go to Sweden. Now there might be a little bit more reluctance towards investing into coaches, so that maybe slows it down. But I guess we'll get there. We will probably be one of the top 5 countries, I believe. But it's going to take some time, but we'll get there because we have tremendously nice facilities now and we have a racket heritage. So I think it's going to be good, but it's going to take time.
And we've got the last few minutes just to wrap up. So what really should countries, markets, regions be learning from Sweden? Was Sweden just absolutely unique in its time and place and context and almost unrepeatable? You hear sometimes people say, oh, London and the UK needs to be careful not to do as Sweden, or Miami in the US needs to be careful not to do as Sweden, or the Middle East is going to be the next Sweden. What are the key lessons that should be learned from Sweden and what aren't? What are the lessons that really are not applicable to anywhere else?
Depends on from which perspective you look as well. From a club owner perspective, I really believe in the community around the club, to have a strong club manager that can create a nice atmosphere inside the facility. And I think that's what we see, and I think Sebastian touched a little bit on it as well, that those are the type of clubs we see still go strong. And it's not so much maybe about the locker rooms or if you have a swimming pool in the facility. I think you can manage to create a good community with quite low investments on the interior. So I think that should be the primarily focus. And then speaking about operating a chain, owning several locations, and this is something maybe Sebastian have some good insights and have done some thinking around. But I think you still need to keep the local touch for each club. So when you scale your club business, there is not one model that will fit into all the clubs in different locations. I really believe that you need to stay close to the local community and build strategies around them. Then you can, of course, find synergies between the clubs, but it's still important, I believe, to have the local touch. And again, I think consider Padel as a sport, maybe a little bit more than what Sweden did. In the end, Padel is a sport. It's not a pre-party. It's not a party. It's a sport. And the initiatives you do should be maybe primarily around that. That's my take.
Yeah, you're totally right. I think that it was one of a kind. I don't think it's going to happen again because there were a combination of internal and external factors at the same time. So it's sort of a perfect storm with, I'm going to repeat myself now, but obviously low interest rates. Sweden are very entrepreneurial, COVID-19, aggressive real estate investors, 2 big funds consolidating at the same time, global sport booming, blah, blah, blah. All these things combined, obviously. But on club level, I totally agree. We are thinking about this a lot because this is my day-to-day job, and you need to think locally. You need to have a local club manager. People tend to sort of focus on the infrastructure a lot, which is very obvious. I've seen so many pitch decks floating around and they do the same math. It's a very, very easy math, obviously. I mean, we've all seen it, like 1 tennis court, 3 paddle courts, 9 meter ceiling height, and this is the rent. And everybody's like, oh, we only need 3 hours per court per day, and then we'll break even. I mean, Spain did the same mistake, and they just opened up 5,000 courts outdoor in Spain, and that went bad. Sweden did the same thing. I think you need to focus on product. You need to focus on content, because that's what drives it. Like Andreas said, it's not a party, it's a sport, but you need to attract. I mean, women, they want events. They want something to happen. Men, they want more the competitive side of it. They want tournaments, leagues, Americanos. This is not like during COVID where it was more like a Tinder date to go and play on paddle. That was temporary. So I think now in the UK at least, and also in Denmark, Denmark is pretty mature market for us, but we need to redevelop ourselves all the time and see what is the market looking for. Like our club in Ilford in East London has a totally different demographic than the one we're going to open now in Battersea Power Station. So the memberships need to be different, pricing probably different, offering different, Even the menu is different. So I think it's very hard for someone to come and say, we're going to do the McDonald's of paddle. I would never put a dime on that because I'm pretty sure that it won't work. However, looking at unique positioning in the market, like AAA locations, do the proper math, factor in the unknown. I can't tell you what it is because it's an unknown. But in Sweden, it was COVID, it was higher interest rates, it was a lot of stuff. So you need to factor those details in, and it's hard work. I think also something that fueled a lot of people into paddle was that people thought that it was easy to open up a club, but it's not easy. I mean, the people I know that are actually excelling in paddle, they are among the hardest workers I know, because in sports, in the end, people are not willing to pay, £100. Maybe they are in certain locations in New York and London, but in general, the margins are not going to be these 30% EBITDA Swedish temporary COVID margins. They will be lower. So you need to work hard and you need to offer a goddamn good product, because you're competing with restaurants, you're competing with the yoga, you're competing with having a glass of wine on a nice restaurant. So you need to be offering a nice product, a good atmosphere, and it's not in the curtains, I believe. I agree with Andreas there, although it's nice with nice curtains, but that's not going to make it or break it for you. I think if you focus on product and you deliver a nice experience for people, then you have a very, very good opportunity to excel if you have done the math correctly.
I remember during the craziest times, when we onboard a new club to the system, we prepare everything in the background, and then we have sort of a button we click when we want to make them live and public. And I had a colleague sitting next to me, and he made one of those clubs live. And we could see in the schedule in front of us how it just went bookings in real time showing up immediately, without any marketing, without anything. Just the moment when we made them live, it filled up the entire schedule more or less. And even if it was COVID, it would have been hard to sell toilet paper on the same level as paddle times. So it was probably a little bit too easy to open up a club and have a very strong business case from day one.
Well, we've come to about an hour, so I think we should wrap it up at this point. But I wanted to thank you very much for joining us for this episode. Astrid, thank you. And of course, thank you to Sebastian and Andreas for taking us under the hood of what happened during these last 5, 10, 15 years in the Swedish market. We'll be back with the next episode in a week's time as we continue to try and cover all the angles in the business of paddle. For now, thank you very much.